Figuring out the electrical system has got to be the most intimidating part of the van build process. I know what worked for me was buying the appliances I thought I'd need as I was building out the interior with that 80/20 aluminum. It gave me about 6 months to really think about it. For stuff I couldn't afford right away, like the batteries, I got their dimensions on Amazon and just built cardboard mock-ups just so I could work around the space. Once I felt confident enough that I had everything that I needed to know the total power draw of my system before I could lay down a single wire. Power draw is watts, it's simply volts times amps. You can find that information on little stickers of all your electronics devices. You need to know that because it tells you how big your battery bank is going to need to be. It also tells you how big your master fuse is going to have to be. You want your master fuse to be able to handle everything turned on at once without anything blowing or any electrical fires starting. With all of that in mind, I was ready to start building. I made a little diagram of what I did. I have a link to it in the caption below this video. I'm going to walk you guys through. This covers pretty much everything. Let's take a look. My diagram is divided into 5 parts. In the upper left in the blue is the core system. This includes the batteries and the bus bars around it. Clockwise from there in the purple are my charge sources. This includes the shore power charging and alternator charging, also known as DC to DC charging. In the salmon are all my DC loads. In the green section are all my AC loads. This is basically anything that plugs into a 2-prong or 3-prong outlet like you have in your house. And last but not least, my solar setup is down here in the lower left. I have 370 amp hour batteries wired in parallel. That's when you connect all the pluses together and all the negatives together. This keeps the voltage at 12 volts, but it increases the capacitance, so this is a 510 amp hour system. Notice also how I have the power and ground leads coming out of opposite sides of the setup. You want to do this so power is drawn from the batteries evenly. If you have both leads coming out of the same battery, that battery is going to be, drained down to nothing before the other two. So first I'll follow the power line. It comes out here, and then there's a branch that goes off and connects to a shunt right here. This shunt connects to my Victron battery monitor. The reason I have this connected directly to the battery like this and not behind a switch is because if I want to turn my whole system off, I still want to be able to know how much battery life I have left. So moving on, after that branch, the power line goes through first one switch, then my master fuse, which would blow if something were catastrophically wrong, then another switch, and then from there into my links distributor, which is basically a big bus bar. The reason I have my fuse sandwiched between 2 switches like this is because, it can receive charge from either end. It can receive it from my house battery, but if I were charging my house battery from the alternator, for example, then charge would be coming the other way. If I ever had to service this fuse and replace it, I don't want to be shocked, and I could receive, positive charge from either direction. So you really need to cut it off at both ends. So back down following the ground wire, it just comes out here. It connects to that battery monitor here, and then you follow along and it connects into that links distributor. I use 4/0 gauge wire, which is very heavy duty wire. We're dealing with a lot of current here, so you want to use the thickest wire you can get away with. The links distributor has 4 branches coming off of it that go to the other 4 systems I have in my diagram. Branch number 1 right here goes through a 60 amp fuse, then a switch, and then you see it goes down to my solar setup, which I'll go over in a minute. Branch number 2 goes through a 300 amp fuse, another switch, and then that goes to my AC system down here. I'll go over that as well. But As you can see, I use a very heavy-duty fuse for this because an inverter, which converts DC to AC power, you're dealing with a lot of current. Branch number 3 over here goes to 2 more bus bars, each of which go through another set of fuses. You're probably wondering why I didn't just use a second links distributor here and connect it. I could have done that. It would have consolidated stuff. The thing with these links distributors, they're not very space efficient. They're about the size of a shoebox. And if you're dealing with tight spaces, you just have more flexibility using individual bus bars like I did here. It's the same either way. So the fourth and final branch out of my core system up here at the top goes through a 60 amp fuse, then another system switch, and this goes to my DC to DC charger, my whole charging system, which I will go over soon enough. Now, you may notice in my system, I tended to use heavier gauge wire than I needed to in a lot of places. There's nothing wrong with doing that. It's perfectly safe. The reason you wouldn't want to do that is because the heavier gauge wire is, well, it's heavier. It's also more expensive. Although I found that last part not to be totally true. What happens is, for example, this 4/0 gauge wire, I probably only needed 5 feet of it, but you have to buy it in rolls of 10 feet. So you end up with all this leftover wire. So for me, before I just bought a whole new roll of wire, I want to use up what I already have. So in places where I probably could have gotten away with 1 gauge wire, I used the 4/0 gauge wire that I had left over. In places where I probably could have used 10 gauge wire, I just used up the 8 gauge wire that I had left over. Like I said, there's nothing wrong with over gauging your wires. Another thing to note is this links distributor also holds these 4 fuses inside of it. So following branch number 1, which goes to my solar setup, first it goes through a 60 amp fuse, then a switch to cut that off in case I ever want to service it. Then it goes into my solar MPPT charge controller. This device basically regulates the current that comes in through the solar panel, converts it to the right voltage, and feeds it to your battery system. So after it goes through that, the power wire goes through another switch. This is for the same reason that I put switches on either side of my master fuse. It could receive charge through these panels or through the house battery. So if I ever want to service the charge controller, I want to cut it off on either side. After that switch, it goes through a 50 amp breaker. You're probably wondering why I have a circuit breaker here and a fuse way back here. This 60 amp fuse protects my solar charge controller, which is rated for 50 amps. This breaker protects my solar panels and the wires coming out of them. I also used a breaker here instead of a fuse because I wasn't sure where I was going to put this, and a breaker is just easy to reset. It's just flipping a switch. It doesn't have to be like unscrewed the way a fuse has to be. After that breaker, it goes through an entry gland. This is something you can attach to the roof. It just seals up real good, makes a nice tight waterproof connection for your wire to come in and out of your roof. From there, it goes through what's called an MC4 connector. This connects your wire to the wires that come built into your solar panel. Now, I have 3 100-watt solar panels in this diagram connected in series. That's where the positive node of one is connected to the negative node of the other. This keeps the current low while increasing the voltage. It doesn't really matter if you wire it in series or in parallel down here, because once the current comes into the charge controller, this is going to change the voltage anyway. It's going to drop or increase it to whatever it needs to be. So the only time I think it would ever really matter how you wire these is if it's a huge system, like for a house with lots of panels, then you're probably going to want to wire it in series just to keep the current down low so you don't have to deal with big thick cables that get really hot. And so the ground connection, same thing. It comes out of that Lynx distributor, goes right to the charge controller, right from there to the MC4 and to the panel. Now, I use 8 gauge wire in this whole solar setup only because that's the thickest wire that this charge controller that I got could accept. I would have preferred to use something a little thicker than that, but I trust that Victron, knows what they're doing. When it comes to mounting solar panels, they do make flat solar panels that you can kind of adhere directly to the roof of your vehicle. I don't recommend using those. If you're in a sunny, hot place, the roof is going to get very hot and it could end up damaging those solar panels. I've read some horror stories online. You kind of want to leave a cushion of air between your solar panel and the roof. All right, now back to the Lynx distributor. Branch number 2 out of the distributor goes to my AC system down here. So the power wire first goes through a 300 amp fuse, which is very heavy duty, and you're also going to need to use very heavy duty wire here. I use 4-aught gauge because an AC inverter uses up a ton of power. After the fuse, it goes through a switch just so I can cut this branch off if I need to service it. And then it goes into the positive node of my inverter. Now, I have a 3000 watt sine wave inverter. Remember, watts is volts times amps, so 3000 divided by 12 volts. This is like 250 amps of current potentially coming through here. You want to be very careful. This thing can also get pretty hot as well. Now, at the opposite end of the inverter, it just has 3 regular 3-prong outlets that you can just plug anything into. But it's kind of in an inconvenient place in my van. So I bought these extension sort of outlets that you can just plug into it and put on my wall. I have one right next to my bed, and into that I have permanently connected some orange Christmas lights. I love these lights. I could only find them in AC version. They're much brighter than the fairy lights that are DC. I just kind of leave it dangling and plug it in here whenever I want the ambiance. The other outlet down here I have in my kitchen, over my countertop. That's in case I ever want to plug in a kitchen appliance. I have right next to it a CO detector that charges via USB. I have a USB cable plugged directly into this and into the outlet on the other side, so I never have to deal with changing the batteries in it. It's just kind of self-charging. It's very convenient. The third and final outlet on my inverter I use for my water heater. So the first, I had to buy an extension cord. 6 feet was enough just so I could get from here to my sink area. Before it goes into the water heater, I have it going through a little timer right here because the water heater also uses a lot of power, and if you forget to turn it off, you can seriously drain your battery very fast. The AC timer, it just times down to 0 and then it shuts off. I also added a switch right here that is lit with an LED because I didn't necessarily trust this. It came from Amazon in an unmarked box. There's no way of knowing if it's actually working or not, and I didn't want to risk it. This with the LED lets me know whether there's power going through this line or not. So that's my AC system. It's pretty cut and dry. The inverter that I have by Renogy comes with a remote switch that you can plug into it. It runs through a standard telephone line, and then you can put the switch on your wall panel. It's a great way to turn the inverter on and off. Generally, you don't want to leave the thing on all the time, even though it's tempting. It just uses up way too much power. Back to branch number 3 on my Lynx distributor. This is the one that goes to 2 separate bus bars. The power line goes through a 250 amp fuse. This kind of covers everything that is coming into this bus bar. It's pretty heavy duty. It goes into this bus bar and there are 4 nodes coming out of it. I'll start with this one down here. In both the positive and negative bus bars, I left one node free. This is for in case I ever want to expand my system. There's a great place I can connect into right here. Another node on the power bus bar goes through a switch just to connect the branch, a 150 amp fuse, and then through a 1/0 gauge cable, which is pretty heavy duty, into my first DC fuse box. I used a Safety Hub 150 right here. This fuse box connects all my heavier loads, which includes my max air fan, my pump, my fridge, and my Rixson hydronic heating system. Now, I noticed for DC devices, especially these 3, they tend not to come with a master on-off switch, something that I find infuriating. So I hardwired my own switch, just so I can make sure these things aren't draining my battery just when I'm not around. Each of these has what is called an ATC fuse. When you buy the Safety Hub 150, it comes with a bunch of fuses. I don't think I had to buy any new ones, so just keep that in mind. Now, there is another node coming off that bus bar that goes through a switch, another 100 amp fuse, through a fairly heavy duty wire, 2 gauge, that runs all the way through here, and this goes to my other DC fuse box. This is the one next to my bed in my control panel that controls all my lights. The way I have this set up is from this fuse box, I used a 4 switch panel that you can find in the automotive section on Amazon. The switch panel I used, you'll notice it's also connected with a ground wire. That's because there are LEDs on the switch panel that are always on, whether the switch is in the on or off position or not. That makes this device essentially an electrical component in and of itself, so it needs a permanent ground connection. Now, out of each switch, it goes to a USB outlet, which is also grounded. And then to each of these 4 USB outlets, I have wired up 4 different USB operated LED strip lights. 2 of them are strip lights, one is fairy lights, and one is a disco ball light, and they all come with their own remotes. These use very low current, I think like less than an amp for each one. You can just use little ATC fuses and put them in this fuse box right here. The only thing in this fuse box that isn't a light that I also connected is this fan. This fan gimbals. I have it next to a window next to my bed. I absolutely love it. And you can see how that is basically my entire DC system coming off of these 2 nodes in the bus bar right here. Now this third and final node comes out of this bus bar through a switch, through a 15 amp fuse, which is in line, through an 8 gauge wire to this. This is my Noco Genius AC to DC charger. Now you plug in through shore power, which is just a line, from a house, any outlet. If you want to charge your car, it plugs into this node right here. There's a third node on the charger I got that connects from here to a switch, a 3-way switch. When this 3-way switch is in the 1 position, then this makes a connection right to the car battery's power. That way, I can use this shore power charger to charge either my house battery or my car battery. This is super convenient. I highly recommend wiring this up if you can do it. All you would do is plug in a shore power here and then select the button of which battery you want to charge. If you select this button here, it charges my lithium batteries. If you select this button here, you also have to switch this three-way switch in the one position, and then it will charge the car battery. I keep that three-way switch right behind my driver's seat. That's so if I'm driving and I forget to activate it, I can just reach back and turn it on. Now, the reason I use the three-way switch is kind of to eliminate something that could be potentially dangerous. You don't want to be charging your house battery plugged into shore power at the same time that you're charging your house battery from the DC to DC charger over here. You also don't want to be charging your house battery through this thing. Charging your car battery through this thing, and also charging your house battery through the car battery through the DC to DC charger. It sounds like a mess because it is, but using a three-way switch ensures that that can never ever happen. You're forced to choose a connection. Either you connect the car battery to your shore power, or you connect the car battery to your DC to DC charger, or it's in the off position and totally disconnected. Now, this branch, the fourth and final branch from my core system, goes through a 60 amp fuse, a master switch right here, and this goes to my DC to DC charger. This is what you need if you want to use what they call alternator charging, where you can charge your lithium battery while you're driving. Now, they call it alternator charging. You're really charging off the car battery. You just connect right to the car battery. It's very easy. So one wire connects to my three-way switch. If this is in the number 2 position, that makes a connection that goes to this 60 amp fuse into the positive node of the car battery. And the negative ground of the DC to DC charger goes right to the negative of the car battery. And through this system, I have the car battery's ground connected to my lithium battery's ground, so they all have a common ground. There's a third wire here. In older DC to DC chargers, there's a wire here. It's called a D plus wire. It needs to be connected to the car battery at all time. It's just sort of a sensor to know when to turn the system on and off. In the version I got, it's actually by remote, so there's no wire here. If you do have a wire, I recommend putting a switch in here that you can turn off. Otherwise, this has a potential of slowly draining your car battery. That, folks, is how my entire charge system works and links up to my core system over here. I want to finish this video by talking about placement of all your components in your van. This stuff, it takes up a lot of space. We're talking a couple cubic yards dedicated to this stuff. You're going to be able to want easy access to it. Imagine if a fuse blows, or there's a short circuit, or you smell a fire or something, an emergency situation, and it's winter. You don't want to have to go outside or crawl into a space in order to access all your stuff. You want everything right within arm's reach. Fuses, kill switches especially. And that's what I kind of did here with this tower setup. I'll show you what I did. In this tower right here, which is right next to my bed, I keep my Lynx distributor and all of my kill switches. I keep little lights in here just so I can, have lighting in here in case it's the middle of the night and I want to change something. Last but not least, my inverter and a lot of my electrical components underneath here. Basically some master on-off switches that I wired, a thermostat, my inverter, stuff that has its own on and off switch, and my Rixon air conditioning system is all underneath this panel right here. But my main battery bank is this over here, which fits 3 170 amp hour Renogy batteries for a total of 510 amp hours, which has proven to be more than enough. So folks, that's everything I can think of with my electrical system. My channel is called Under the Radar because I live in this vehicle 5 nights a week. I try to keep that aspect of my life, under the radar and stick to exploration type videos. I find myself moving towards some point where I'm mixing the two. I don't know. I'm still figuring that out, figuring out what this YouTube is for me. But if you have any questions or comments about living in a van, about the electrical stuff, maybe you have improvements on the diagram, I'd love to hear all of it. Reach out to me. In any case, sayonara, Happy New Year, bon voyage, all of that stuff. I'll see ya.